Hello everyone, this is CGTN bringing you live from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. Now behind me you can see the plane carrying the remains of 20 Chinese volunteer soldiers has just landed, and they are being returned to China today. Now a memorial ceremony will be held later on to mark their return. Now this plane is from China's Air Force. They're carrying the remains of 20 Chinese volunteer soldiers. And we have also seen 2 J-11 fighter jets escorting the plane home once it entered China's airspace. Now, for those people who have fought alongside these soldiers during the war, as well as the relatives, the flight from South Korea today could be the flight they've been waiting for over half a century. And the memorial ceremony will be a very touching and a personal moment for them. And today's ceremony has evoked great emotion among many Chinese people, because these 20 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers, their identities were unknown. Veterans at the ceremony today can only regard them as comrades in arms. And for the relatives, what really matters is bringing the remains back to home soil. Now we can see the People's Liberation Army representatives from the PLA will get on the plane. They will handle the coffins down to the ground. We can see the red curtain. It's all been set, and the tables covered in blue curtains. It's worth mentioning that the coffins will be covered by China's national flag, which is the highest honor given by the People's Liberation Army. Now, to give you some backgrounds about the Korean War, nearly 2.4 million Chinese volunteer soldiers were sent to the DPRK in the early 1950s to join the Korean War. And the latest statistic shows more than 180,000 officers and soldiers from the Chinese volunteer soldiers died during the war. Now, according to people who have devoted more than 30 years of honor to the veterans at the Museum War of Resistance U.S. Aggression and Aid Korea in Dandong, only a small percentage of the volunteers were buried in China. Many of the dead were interred in cemeteries in the DPRK. Others lie in unmarked graves scattered across the Korean peninsula, including Mao Yang, the son of Chairman Mao Zedong, died during the Korean War and was buried in the DPRK. Now we can see the PLA, the representatives from the PLA is getting on the plane. This is a yearly event since 2014, and it is the 5th batch of remains returned by South Korea. Now, the repatriation takes place ahead of China's annual Qingming Festival, or known as Tomb Sweeping Festival. That's the time when people in China visit and clean the graves of their ancestors. In 2013, South Korea started excavating the remains of Chinese soldiers buried at a cemetery in the border city of Paju, that's in South Korea, under an agreement reached with China. The excavation work usually lasts a few months, as the remains will be washed, dried, and then placed in coffins by the South Korean side before being returned to China. Now, scientists have worked to identify them by analyzing uniforms and ammunition, but often fail to put a name to the fallen soldiers. Okay, the ceremony will last about half an hour. And tomorrow, these 20 sets of remains will be buried in the Korean Martyrs Cemetery in Shenyang. That's where the previous remains returned since 2014. And up till now, the total sets of remains returned by South Korea to China has reached nearly 600. The exact number is 589 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers. And this move came after former South Korean President Park Geun-hye offered to return the remains of Chinese soldiers to China in 2013. The first batch remains returned was in 2014, and this year is the 5th annual return under the 2013 agreement between China and South Korea. And on Thursday morning, which is tomorrow, the remains will be buried at the Korean Martyrs Cemetery in Shenyang. And also it is worth mentioning that after the return this time, the newly formed Ministry of Veteran Affairs, following the structural reform of China's State Council, will take charge of the relevant work regarding the settlement of remains for the Chinese volunteer soldiers. Previously, the task were handled by different governmental bodies like the Ministry of Civil Affairs, the Ministry of Human Resources, and the Social Security and the Central Military Commission. To give you more details about the Ministry of Veteran Affairs, it is a part of the government reshuffle. A Ministry of Veteran Affairs is formed during the 2 sessions this year according to a plan released during the 2 sessions. And the move shows that the promise previously made by Chinese President Xi Jinping has been fulfilled, in which President Xi said, we will establish an administration for veterans, protect the legitimate rights and the interests of military personnel and their families. Now we can see the representatives from the PLA. They've been here since early this morning. The relatives of the remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers have also been gathering at the airport this morning. But the whole area is heavily guarded for safety reasons because this is the runway of the airport. Just over there you can see. That's the civil airplanes from China's Southern Airline. We have been covering the event since 2014, and I must say that every time I came here, I can feel this is the moment that many people related to the Korean War, they have attached great emotion to the event. Okay, that's the officers from the Ministry of Civil Affairs in China. And 60 years on, the legacy of the Korean War still hangs over the Korean Peninsula and it still leaves a lasting impact on the region. Okay. For the military enthusiasts, you must know the type of the plane in front of us. This is IL-76, designed by the former Soviet Union. It's commonly can be seen in PLA's Air Force as air freighter. Okay, let's move the camera to the right. You can see the amount of media have come to the airport this morning. Some of the media are from Beijing and also from the local television channels. Now back to what I was saying, the new Ministry of Veteran Affairs is to draft policies and regulations related to demobilization military personnel and put them into practice and to publicize to society achievements made by the veterans for the country and its people. and to deal with issues regarding training and reemployment, to support veterans' family members, and to handle issues on pension and retirement benefits, as well as to take care of military cemeteries to organize commemoration activities. So the Ministry of Veteran Affairs will take charge of the settlement of the remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers after this year's event. Right, let's just be patient. For the relatives of the Chinese volunteer soldiers, this is the flight they've been waiting for more than 6 decades. Unfortunately, the identities of the remains being returned are unknown. Scientists have often worked to identify them by uniforms or ammunitions, but often fail to put a name on them because it's been over 60 years. And by the time they were unearthed in South Korea, the conditions were not feasible for identification. I can still recall in 2014, in that year, the remains being returned is reached over 400 sets. So it's much bigger in scale in terms of the commemoration ceremony. Today, you see the tables, there are only 20 sets of tables. They are for the 20 coffins of Chinese volunteer soldiers. And people in China often take commemoration of war as the opportunity to reflect the lessons of the war and cherish the hard-won peace. And some veterans told us that if the Korean Peninsula related issues cannot be solved by military means 60 years ago, it is still the case for today. And only by promoting peace and the stability on the Korean Peninsula can we secure a fruitful and bright future. Okay. And as I said earlier, for people who have fought alongside these soldiers during the war, as well as the relatives, this is the moment they've been waiting for over 6 decades. The memorial ceremony later on will be a very touching and a personal moment for the veterans and their relatives. Okay, this is taking a little bit longer than we expected. The repatriation of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers take place on a yearly basis just before the tomb sweeping day This is an agreement reached by South Korea and China in 2013 when the former South Korean President Park Geun-hye made an official visit to China. And the excavation work started in 2013, just near the border city Paju, where the Chinese soldiers buried in the cemeteries there. More than 180,000 Chinese volunteer soldiers have died during the Korean War, but very few of them were actually buried in China. Okay. The reason why it takes a little longer than we expected for these soldiers to take the coffins down to the plane is that they need to arrange all the personal belongings of the remains in the plane before getting off the aircraft. Later on today, senior officials from the People's Liberation Army and also from the Ministry of Civil Affairs will deliver a key speech just over there behind the media plot. It's a little bit windy today in Shenyang. It's normally at this time of the year the weather is getting extremely cloudy and windy as well. The excavation work of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers usually lasts a few months, normally 3 to 4 months, as the remains will be washed, dried, and then placed in coffins by the South Korean before being returned to China. And the remains unearthed, the 20 sets of remains unearthed this year, they were unearthed between March and November in 2017, which is last year. The scientists has to work on the identification process to identify them by their uniforms, ammunitions, their personal belongings, but often fail to put a name on them, which is a sad truth for those relatives who have their family members died during the war or missing during the Korean War. The flight from South Korea to China today is about 2 hours. The plane take off at 10 a.m. in South Korea time and landed at 11:30 here in Shenyang Taoxian International Airport at around 11:30. Okay, now we can see the coffins are being carried by the PLA officers. These officers, they've been going through rehearsals and practice for a couple of weeks. You see the pace of the soldiers, exact the same. Okay, they are walking around the plane. So 20 sets of remains of Chinese volunteer soldiers are now reaching their home soil. 60 years on, the legacy of the Korean War still hangs over Korean Peninsula. And some veterans have told us if the Korean Peninsula related issue cannot be solved by military means over 60 years ago, it is still the case for today. And people at the ceremony today can only regard the 20 sets of remains as their comrades in arms because their identities were unknown. But what really matters is bringing the remains back to their home soil. And nearly 2.4 million Chinese volunteer soldiers were sent to the DPRK through the Yalu River, across the Yalu River in just at the border city of Dandong in 1950 to join the Korean War. And only a very small percentage of the Chinese volunteer soldiers were buried in China. Okay, for those of you who have just joined our program, let me walk you through what's been happening here at Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. The plane carrying the remains of 20 sets of Chinese volunteer soldiers have touched down at around 11:30 this morning. Two J-11 fighter jets were escorting the plane as soon as it reached China's airspace. The remains are being placed in coffins, which will be handed down by the officers from the People's Liberation Army and placed onto the table on the red carpet. The coffins will be covered by China's national flag, which is the highest honor can be given by the People's Liberation Army. And for the relatives and the veterans who have fought alongside these 20 soldiers, this could be the flight they've been waiting for over 6 decades. Nearly 2.4 million Chinese volunteer soldiers joined the Korean War in the 1950s, and also nearly over 180,000 of them died during the war, but very few of them, less than 5% of them, were actually buried in their home soil in China. The majority of the deceased were buried in the DPRK, scattered across the cemeteries in the Korean Peninsula. In a couple of minutes' time, the coffins will be carried onto the table and a ceremony will kickstart following a speech delivered by the senior officials from the People's Liberation Army as well as the Ministry of Civil Affairs. And after the return this time, the relevant work regarding the settlement of Chinese volunteer soldiers will be handled by the newly formed Ministry of Veteran Affairs, which is a newly formed governmental body during the 2 sessions. Okay, we would like to take you around to show you what is out there today in the event, but unfortunately the media stuff is strictly restricted of where we can actually go. We can see this is the media from the local TV and newspaper, the restricted areas. Okay, now we can see they're preparing the coffins. Now, the repatriation takes place ahead of China's annual Qingming, or Tomb Sweeping Day, when people visit and clean the graves of their ancestors. As I said earlier, only a small percentage of veterans, of the deceased veterans, were buried in China. Many of the dead were actually interred in cemeteries in the DPRK, including Mao Guan, the son of Chairman Mao Zedong, died during the Korean War and was buried in the DPRK. Okay, that's the final few coffins. You can see people who dressed in blue uniforms. They are from the PLA's Air Force. You 拍得走过来吗？跟过来。 As a part of government reshuffle, the Ministry of Veteran Affairs is formed according to a plan released during the 2 sessions this year. The new ministry will take charge of the remains take charge of the relevant work regarding the remains being returned by South Korea after this year's event. Okay, as I said, the coffins are being covered by China's national flag, which is the highest honor can be given by the People's Liberation Army. And the soldiers from the PLA regard these 20 soldiers as truly their national hero. They are marching to the center. They will place the coffins on the table, and then the ceremony will kick-start. Okay, so now as the remains of 20 sets of Chinese volunteer soldiers have been returned to their home soil, the commemoration ceremony will kick-start in just a minute. This is Guan Yang reporting from Shenyang Taoxian International Airport. We will keep you updated with the latest happening tomorrow morning once the remains are buried in the Korean Martyrs Cemetery in Shenyang. Bye-bye.